imagine running analytics for a startup. Yeah? Now imagine that startup has 90,000 employees. That's the scale and speed Gary Burnette deals with as a CDO at Kyndryl. Let's hear his incredible story of transformation. I would like to invite Gary Burnette on stage. Lovely. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that introduction. Good morning. I think one of the things that has kind of transpired over, kind of looking at me, what has been a relatively long career, is that you come to a conference today in 2025, and you listen to people from across all industries talk about data and AI much the same way, right? Go back a few years, and it was a bunch of technical guys talking about their technical products and people listening. But now we're all kind of dealing with and facing some of the same things. And the good news is that means we can all kind of learn from each other. And so with that in mind, I hope a little bit of this story that I'm about to take you through resonates with you. I don't expect everybody is doing everything that I'm going to talk about, but I do think there are elements of what we've been working through that I think do absolutely apply. And hopefully there's some takeaways for you. Just like for me in the last session, trust the grill. I'm going to trust the grill from now on. I love that. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of background about Kyndryl. Kyndryl was a spin-out from IBM in 2021, September 1st of 2021. We do business in 6 primary practice areas: cloud, data and AI, security resilience, network and edge, workplace experience, and mainframe. And across those lines, across those practices, we have a managed services operation, and we're growing a consulting business. And when we left IBM, we were one of many lines of business. We were primarily the technical services part of IBM, and so as our CHRO likes to say, when you are quote-unquote spun out, you leave with a suitcase, right? And so someone packs a suitcase for you, drives you to the train station, and away you go. And when you get to the other end, you unpack the suitcase. You don't know what's in there. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good. And so what was happening, and by the way, it was an absolutely wonderful opportunity of a lifetime to be the chief data officer of a brand new company trying to stand up a brand new data strategy and data literacy in the absence of having any of the sort of background stuff that most of us have to deal with on a daily basis. So as I was beginning this whole data strategy component, I had stuff happening on both sides of me, right? So on the business side, we were trying to figure out what it meant to be Kyndryl. So the line of business that was in IBM was in support of our mainframe business. It was in support of the, and I say our because I came from IBM. It was in support of the mainframe business. It was in support of the software business. It was in support of the consulting business. And frankly, it didn't really much matter if that division in and of itself was outrageously profitable. But once you become a standalone company and your business is managed services and your business is consulting, all of a sudden profitability kind of matters, right? And so on the business side, I still remember in roughly the holidays, 2021, I get a call from our chief operating officer and said, "So have you heard about the 3 A's?" I said, "No." And if you look at our website, by the way, you can still read about the 3 A's, and it's basically the things that we use in the very beginning to help establish ourselves as a firm. And those 3 A's were alliances. Our alliances with other providers, particularly hyperscalers, is really important for a consulting company that really has no products. Our account focus. Remember, we came with a bunch of novated contracts from our customers at IBM that may or may not have been profitable. So we needed to work through how we make them profitable if we're going to continue to exist as a firm. And then last but not least was automation. right? So we wanted to automate a lot of the delivery aspects of how we deliver solutions to our clients so that we could free up resource to then become hyperscaler skilled individuals, Microsoft, AWS, Google, et cetera. So there was all of that going on. And so as the CDO, I was tasked to begin to stand up key KPIs, dashboarding, to use those kind of terms, et cetera, while at the same time, on the IT side, a bunch of stuff was happening. So what was happening on the IT side is that we had a legal and tax responsibility and mandate to separate fully from IBM, its infrastructure, its applications, and its networks by the second-year anniversary of our firm. And so what that meant was that a lot of what was happening in the IT estate was changing the applications and the sources of data around the very KPIs and dashboards I was trying to build on the business side. So there was a lot of moving parts here. And so if you look at the chart here, I talked about the 2-year split, but the other thing that was happening is that we came with a set of processes that were aligned to a division within a very, very large company. And they were very, let's just say, rich. And we didn't need a lot of that. So there was a major focus both on the business side and the IT side to simplify the way we were working and simplify the processes that we put in front of our practitioners. And so if you look over on the right-hand side, the data transformation and how we began to evolve that to support a changing business and a changing IT landscape. From an IT perspective, we stated or created, and by the way, I had the enterprise architecture team for a part of this as well, but we stood up 5 key disciplines or 5 key points of our strategy. Number 1, cloud-based. And I can tell you we are today, and we'll get to that in a minute, but we are 100% cloud. We have no on-prem. But that was a key part of our overall IT strategy from a cost perspective and from a scaling perspective to get to cloud. We are platform first. And by that I mean we don't have a lot of individual applications. We focused on key leading platforms and the data that's created out of those key leading platforms. Right smack dab in the middle of that is data-centric. We wanted to be making our decisions based on data. We wanted to run our firm based on data. We wanted to report to the street based on data. And we wanted to gauge our response and our success in becoming a profitable managed services and consulting firm based on what the data was telling us. Automation-led, I talked about before, and then last but not least, around the security aspects of how we wanted to run the business, we adopted this zero trust methodology. So that was the IT sort of strategy that was happening over, kind of next door or adjacent to my overall data strategy. And then within the data focus, we looked at things like, transparent governance. We looked at single sources of truth, or at least minimal sources of truth. We looked at automating our processes, et cetera. And what we wound up creating was an enterprise data warehouse. We called it Kinsight. When you work for a company called Kyndryl, you find all kinds of creative uses of the word kin. So Insight became Kinsight, and that's what we wound up calling our data platform. It is based on Azure Data Platform, so it is largely a data lake-based platform. Now, as time has progressed, we're now talking about 3 to 4 years ago. As time has progressed, we're looking more at things like Fabric and some other things. But at the time this was created, very much a data lake kind of platform. And if you look at the chart, kind of in the center of that, you see customer, you see supplier, et cetera. One of the things we needed to establish early on is what were going to be those core data components that we wanted to integrate our data sets around, right? What was the semantic what were the semantics going to look like, and how are we going to integrate the various data sets as we evolved them from the legacy to the strategy and made them fit for purpose as it related to BI in the beginning, and as you'll see as we progress through this conversation, AI towards the middle of the process. We spent a lot of time focused on the business, partnering with the business, because at the end of the day, I really need them to adopt this sort of mantra around simplification and operating on data, because ultimately, if they don't, then my job impossible, frankly. And so there was a lot of work spent around getting the business engaged through councils at the executive level, helping to drive priorities, make decisions, et cetera, but also at the working level around data standards, around data stewards, what does the various components of data look like? And then at the same time, we were standing up our data governance. Standing next to us in the booths is Calibra. We stood up Calibra as our data governance kind of platform around catalog and around data quality. And that's basically the challenge that we had in the beginning and how we kind of responded to that challenge. Okay. There's another challenge, is using the clicker, I guess. So starting points and challenges. So I talked about the applications. Kyndryl came with 1,800 applications. Now, most of those were little small applications that had been created to support one business unit or another, one country or another. We came with 4 separate silos of master data. In the IBM world, we did not have a true MDM solution. We had one for customer, we had one for solutions, we had one for supplier, but we didn't really have one in total. We had at least 7 different ways of rolling up our customers for different reasons. We had, God knows how many, this says 20 plus. Truth of the matter is, I don't think anybody actually knows how many data dictionaries were floating around out there in the ethos that described the data that we had in the environment. We had at least 68, approaching 70 different ways of aggregating data, sometimes for the same things, producing different answers. And we had at least 8 different ways of visualizing data, whether it was, homegrown stuff, to Tableau, to many other kinds of things. Basically, over the course of that period, the outcomes you can see over on the far right, and we'll talk a little bit more about these things in general, but we went from all of those sources of master data to now one, based on SAP's MDG. Our data catalog, we went to one based on Calibra. And that covers not only our internal data, but it also includes much of the data that we collect about our customers' environments as we are in managed services engagements with our various customers. We have one cloud-based strategic data platform, I mentioned that earlier, called Kinsight. And then you can look on the far right-hand side. Those 68, we reduced them down to one. And we reduced them down to one by taking a slightly different approach to what I think a lot of times happens. A lot of times I think we look at what we have as the requirements for what we want. And instead, we took a very different approach. We took a more of a greenfield approach where we asked the business, okay, what are the actual KPIs you use to run your business? And then we went about creating those KPIs, as opposed to assuming that all of the ones that they had in these 68 different data warehouses were actually still valid. Because in many cases, they're not. They just keep on living, and nobody ever takes the time to actually reevaluate. We established a strategic platform for data visualization, and we turned off all the others. Let's see, I think I've covered most of those things there. But I think a lot of what was going on here was a significant simplification in the data landscape. And it was necessary from a cost perspective, from an efficiency perspective, and actually to be able to rapidly support an evolving business. So if you look at those things in the middle, our approach was quite simply to follow those architectural principles. The ones that mattered the most to what I was trying to do were the data-centric, platform-first, and cloud-based. The second aspect of this is a little more subtle. We knew in the beginning, because we had seen what had happened before, and a lot of that contributed to those 68 different data platforms that existed around the firm, we wanted to restrict the amount of data movement from place to place. Right? We wanted to only do it when it was necessary. And so we looked very carefully at the personas that were living and breathing and working inside the firm. So remember I talked about the key platforms that we rolled out, key platforms like SAP. Of the 1,800 applications, within that 2-year window, we'd worked it down to 350. And a huge chunk of that reduction were applications that went away and were replaced by SAP. I think it was about 450 of them. Well, guess what? SAP has its own BI type environment. And so for those parts of the business, financial analysts, BAs, and people who analyze claims and things like that, for those people, if they live and breathe totally in SAP, there's absolutely no reason to bring all that data into a data lake and enable them with Power BI. Let them use native SAP. And so part of this sort of strategy around data proliferation and reducing the movement was an assessment around who the users were, who the personas were. Right? So if they're an executive, upline executive, and they want to look at things like attrition from an HR perspective, or they want to look at financial forecasts from a finance perspective, sure, they can get those individually in Workday and SAP, but they're not going to do that. Right? So that's one example of a persona for whom you build a sort of integrated or aggregated kind of KPI for, sets of KPIs for. But if you're down at the working level, you want to bring the analytic to the action. And so we took that approach with both our HR professionals and with many of our finance professionals and people who live and breathe and work like procurement, live and breathe and work inside SAP. So that's a little bit of a subtlety to the overall data strategy. Sure, we built this data platform. We, as you'll see in the next chart, we rolled out a number of different KPIs and dashboards over the first couple of years, but we also supported this sort of notion of living in the platform. So what I've got here is just a very high-level kind of strategy, and I've got it divided up into 3 areas. The red is data infrastructure and security. The green has to do with data governance, and the blue, or whatever color that is, has to do with data management. And so if you look at the red stripe across the top of this was all about building the platform and rolling it out, deciding what the common data model was going to look like, and then deploying the data architecture for the data that lived inside the platform. And I would tell you, it'll show up later in a sort of lessons learned, but we actually had a pivot in this stripe. We thought we could buy a common data model that kind of gave us the answers to the exam, if you will, about those key data components that I talked about on the first chart, you know, supplier and customer and employee, et cetera, et cetera. Turns out that was a lot more problematic than it was worth. So we wound up kind of pivoting to the data objects and the standards that come from the platforms themselves to be our answer to what the internal data architecture was going to look like. So we were informed by the platforms. And so that sort of stripe was going on across 22 to 24. As I said before, we adopted Calibra as our data catalog platform, and we had our first rollout of that all the way back in 2022. We began the rollout of our master data governance platform, MDG, in support of primarily, initially, the SAP components around sales performance management, the actual core SAP, procurement, Ariba, Fieldglass, those kinds of things. That was our first target for the MDG, and then it grew to support other things like our CRM system. Data quality, again, built on Calibra. We first attached that to the MDG solution, MDG solution, and to data quality, and then focused on I think a fairly unique approach to data compliance that brings together Calibra from a data perspective, LeanIX from an understanding of what we have in the landscape with respect to technical applications and platforms, and then OneTrust, which is how we manage compliance. And we made those 3 essentially work together so that we knew what assets needed to have what levels of compliance, and we could track whether or not we were actually achieving that. Across the bottom, data management, rolling out additional dashboarding. I talked about the challenge of doing this while the underlying data was also changing. So there was a fair amount of, I guess for lack of a better word, but technical debt that we kind of took on and frankly had to take on in order to provide dashboarding to the business to begin focusing on the key challenges that we had as a firm while the underlying technology and platform and data sources were changing. So that kind of gives you a high-level sense of what was going on inside the firm. Now, in the middle of all of this, and I love the comment before, AI happens. Right? So the truth of the matter is AI was happening, but all of a sudden, as one of the panelists up here said, or maybe it was Lori early this morning, all of a sudden everybody is informed about AI. Everybody wants to know what you're doing with AI. And I mean, I was just trying to build a data platform. I was just trying to build a data strategy. I was just trying to consolidate data. And all of a sudden, they all want to know what I'm doing with AI. And they're led from places in the business like our CFO, our CMO, because they read about it. And I mean, I'm not trying to dismiss them because these are smart folks. And they want to know, what are you going to do for me? And so the good news is, this kind of convergent chart that you see listed here kind of talks about all that data stuff going on across the top of this. We talked about data consolidation and centralization. We talked about creating APIs and the framework around how we connect systems and how we move data, if we move data. We talked about the data architecture, establishing those semantic components of how we're going to connect the various different databases. And then we talked about how we were going to create analytics. So all this is happening. That's what I've been talking about, right? But across the bottom of this chart is a whole new set of activities around AI. And it starts with an actual corporate or firm-wide or enterprise-wide strategy around what you're actually going to allow with respect to AI in the firm. What are the risks you're willing to take? Reputational risks, financial risks, technical risks. And so we established those kinds of approaches so that we knew what it is that we were going to allow to happen. And then you get into the execution around, okay, so what are the data elements needed for AI, and how do I address the gaps that I've detected as a part of working towards the solution? And that's all before you even start thinking about creating models and deploying the infrastructure around them. But the point I'm making here is that both of these, this sort of convergent strategy around getting to those high-value innovations is required. And this was a nice little trip, I guess, in the middle of that data strategy conversation, was to then say, okay, now what are we going to do with AI? So it's a little bit of the, put the wheels on the bus while the bus is already moving. It's a high-level kind of AI chart that really basically says it's all built on the data, right? So whether we're talking about the data analytics or whether we're talking about the governance, it's all built on that. In the middle, you've got a whole series of AI-based solutions, some of which are predictive, some of which are generative, and we've got lots of examples of both. And I'll share a couple of examples on the next chart. But all of this, the point of all of this, and the point of AI, and I heard it in Lori's conversation this morning, and I think I heard it in the panel as well. The point of all of this is to infuse the business processes and the business rhythms that run your company with AI. It doesn't do any good if it's not connected to how you operate the company. And so making sure you spend the time to do that, as well as to quantify the business outcomes of what you've expected and how you expect this to work and actually do work, are really important. So let me double-click into one of the earlier use cases for AI within Kyndryl, and that was just Copilot. Now, when we began to roll out Copilot, we did it with a very hands-on organizational change management, or OCM, approach. And we did that because we wanted to make sure that we weren't just creating a bunch of use cases that were going to get out there in the ethos, and people might not know about them, might not know how to engage them. And so we were trying to figure out how to grow a deployment of Copilot licenses from essentially nothing to where we basically top this thing out at about 20,000. We've got 20,000 Copilot licenses out there. Use cases. Why do we track use cases? We track use cases to help with the efficiency of not doing the same thing over and over again. And we also track use cases, and we track use cases by persona, because we want a legal person, we want a salesperson, we want a financial person to understand what AI-type solutions might exist within the MS365 framework for them and for their job. And that turned out to be a fairly effective way of sort of spreading the information around what was available to our users at the time in which they needed it. And so if you look at the top 5 things that are there, those are the sort of top 5 areas around how we've rolled this out. And some of them, I'll give you some examples. Some of them are things you would expect, right? So using Copilot, for example, in a Teams meeting to track what's happening in the meeting and to identify the follow-on actions and to assign those actions and to track it. I think everybody would expect that. Using Copilot to help you create a PowerPoint or to create a Word file based on whatever prompts you put into it. And I think a lot of people would expect that. But what you might not expect is we have a couple HR use cases. So we do business in about 60 countries around the world. In those countries, there are local labor laws or labor practices associated with how you pay certain individuals at certain levels. And when you roll it all up, there are 45,000 unique things that we have to deal with in HR. So as a part of our overall payroll simplification, we work to take those 45,000 down to just a few hundred, because as it turns out, some of these things are either not really required legally, but they've kind of just grown up, or there's actually similarities between 2 laws that sound different, but are actually kind of the same way, kind of operate the same way in 2 different countries. So we used Copilot, particularly Copilot Studio, to help us with that transformation. So that's not something a lot of people would necessarily think about. We did the same thing in the HR space, not just with the way we pay our employees in those countries, but also collective bargaining in those places where there are unions involved or works councils. So there's some really creative ways to use some of this stuff, but it all starts with the normalization of the underlying data, in this case, primarily Workday and payroll systems, into places where you can actually trust the data and then build these solutions on top of it. So I'll just leave those as examples of maybe some unexpected use cases for AI, or at least unique ones. We also use it, by the way, in terms of content creation, like everybody probably in this room does, but we use it with our analysts who want to write, give me 150 words about Kyndryl's point of view around data migration, things like that. So there's a lot of use of this stuff in the company, but as I mentioned, it's integrated with our process, it's integrated with how we work, and that's really what I think makes this work. I put this chart in, I'm not going to pitch it, but you remember the chart I showed you with the red and the green and the blue? So this is what we call our journey map for data modernization. And each of those little subway stops, if you click on it, it will tell you what should happen at that subway stop. What's the input to the step? What's the output from the step? What should be done in the step? And this is something that's available to through our consultant client teams to our customers to help them with these journeys, to help you with these journeys. Last but not least, because I want to get to a couple of questions, some key takeaways from what we learned. I mentioned this before, but business partnerships are absolutely essential. You don't do this from a pure IT perspective, or even from a pure CDO perspective. You got to have those business relationships. Create a modern data framework. As it turns out, standing up a data platform is not outrageously hard. What's hard is connecting it to the infrastructure, connecting it to the data sources, and ensuring that the various components of your zero trust environment, like I mentioned before, actually allow access to the data that you need to have access to at the time in which you need it. So that's actually the hard part. Aggregating around single source of truth, and I love this story. So when you stand up a single master data solution like we did, all of a sudden, different parts of the organization, which were used to running somewhat independently, are now kind of codependent. And I remember one of the best examples of this is we used one of those 7 different customer hierarchies that I mentioned to define how we go to market and how we segment our client base and assign our sales teams and client teams to that client base. That was one of those 7 different customer roll-ups. We also began to use it as the sort of hierarchy around how we assign resources to projects that we're doing for customers. So we roll this thing out. the team who do the segmentation and the client work go off and they do their work to reassign and reconfigure how we go to market. And guess what happened? They broke the project team, right? Because now all of a sudden there's this kind of connection that didn't used to exist before because they're both running on the same set of master data. Point is, consolidation is great, but sometimes it can create some interesting sort of byproducts that you didn't expect. And then I think we've talked enough about AI, but it requires a holistic approach across the business, across legal, across technology, in order to make this stuff actually work. And then, of course, at the end of the day, you got to have the right set of skills and resources to be able to do this. I talked kind of fast, but I think that's it. This is me. Find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to talk with you, or I'll be around here for the remainder of the day at least. And love to share stories and hear what's impacting your business, and we can talk a little bit more detail here. So hopefully this was useful. I got about 1 minute and 32 seconds left for questions. So if there are any questions, let me hear them, and we'll try to answer.
Any questions from the audience? Please put your hand up. If not, I have a question for you. What was your biggest surprise during this data transformation?
The biggest surprise? Wow. I would say probably, I think there were positive surprises, things you didn't expect that were actually really good, and then there were things that were challenging. So let me tell you about the positive thing first. I mentioned more than once how important it is to keep the business engaged.
Absolutely.
I was absolutely surprised at how relatively easy that was, because my experience in the parent company was that people did their own thing. Okay, and so one of the constraints can be a financial constraint. If you don't have the budget, if you don't have the resource, if you don't have the people to go do your own thing, then there's a little bit more motivation around supporting the corporate strategies, the enterprise strategies, et cetera. And so I was very pleasantly surprised at how everybody kind of got on the same page, because we all had the same sort of value structure around what we were trying to accomplish as a new company. So that was the positive side. On the negative side, I mean, I think some of the difficulties, and I kind of obliquely referred to this in the charts, or in the lessons learned. I think maybe it was a byproduct of the transformation that was happening in IT as well, but a lot of the sort of CISO-related narrative in the agenda around protecting data, protecting in systems, protecting all of that winds up being really hard.
Right.
And so when you're trying to gain access to data, and those are the things that are basically telling you, no, you can't have it until you work through it, that was a lot more difficult than I think I thought it was going to be. Maybe that was naivete on my part. But I think on that side, that's probably the most the biggest piece of learning. And on the positive side, I think it's just how much people were bought into the overall approach that we were on.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Give it a round of applause for Gary Burnette. If you do have any questions, you do know where to find him at the booths. And with that, we are going to be breaking